Will do. Thank you, Dan. This is exciting because this is Native Plant Week. Who knew? And we got our little bit of rain, re-moistened the soil. So the gardens have a little bit of reprieve. I was very worried about having our atmospheric river back in October and having to wait till next November to get the next significant rain. So it looks like we got a little break. This is not a year ago. I realize I wrote 2021 instead of 2022, but this is today. So you've decided that native plants are going to contribute to habitat and contribute to the birds and the insects in your environment. And you want to have some more information to make very good decisions for your garden. So that's what I'm here about. And I found out that native plants currently account for 3% of nursery sales. So 97% of the time, we're looking at non-native plants in our gardens. And so they're going to be much less familiar to you. And so just like trying a new variety of wine, if you've never tried it before, you're going to go back to your old favorites. Secondly, you might have emotional ties to plants that you're more familiar with because your mother had a rose collection or your aunt loved lilacs. And so I want to bridge that gap of completely unfamiliar plants to something that makes more sense and is more familiar. So sometimes the names actually carry over, the common names. So our Ceanothus is called the California lilac, but of course I think it's much prettier than the non-native lilac. So there are huge benefits to native plants. I do have non-native plants in my garden, a few, and basically the edibles. I have olive trees for olive oil, and they are from the Mediterranean region. But for the backbone of my garden, it's native plants. And I got interested in native plants in 1983 when we moved to Marin, and people were moaning and groaning about the significant drought in the late 70s, how they had to turn off their sprinklers and their lawn died and their landscaping didn't survive. And I looked at Mount Tam, I looked at a south slope, so got lots of sun, very steep, so lots of water runoff, very little topsoil, exposed rocks, and it was all green. There were shrubs that were sort of a jigsaw mixture of Arctostaphylos and chamise. Chamise is in the rose family. Arctostaphylos is actually in the heath family. And these shrubs, with a lot of other smaller plants, coated that south face of Mount Tam through the drought. They didn't have a lot of new growth, but they certainly lived. And there were no sprinklers up there. And I thought, well, logically, let's go native. So they're famous for being drought tolerant. Drought is a little bit different term than our summer dry climate that used to be called the Mediterranean climate. But since it's on the west coast of every continent, California, South America, Africa, and the Mediterranean region, we might as well call it a summer dry climate and get away from those Mediterranean associations of lavender and olive trees. Because we count too. So our summer dry season is every single year. Droughts are more intermittent, maybe more common in the future with global warming. Every plant, every native plant is going to support huge numbers of wildlife, birds and insects. And we need that coating of plants to make Earth livable, and insects are very important, pollinating 90% of species of plants. So we need them to be happy and plentiful as well. Plus, lastly, native plants are stunning. And so you're not gypping yourself on beauty too. Familiarity may become an obstacle because you're not used to them, but when you get used to them, I think you're going to appreciate them. So here's a Manzanita, which is an Arctostaphylos, and with a beautiful sinuous red bark. It's just gorgeous. So native plants, there's always a concern for fire. Fire is more common with temperature rise. And there was an article in Bay Nature, which is a wonderful magazine and website, that the native oaks actually mitigated fire. Junipers, which are, some are native, and eucalyptus, which are non-native, are high oil plants and are fire prone. But oaks have been known to resist fire and intercept and catch embers and slow down a fire's propagation. So people might think that having no plants around their home would be the best protection from fire, but that actually lets embers have laminar flow straight up to your house. So an irrigated or lightly irrigated plant can intercept embers and protect homes. This was written by Michael Ellis, who's just a wonderful naturalist, and explaining how oaks were dealing with fire. When I talk about native plants being more than a plant, but actually a home for animals, that can be further explored by a wonderful book called Nature's Best Hope by Doug Tallamy, who's in Maryland, but we're not going to hold that against him. He does talk about California and how our website, Calscape, which talks about native plants that are would be adapted to your actual home address, that website is not available in any other state. There's no Oregon Scape or Texas Scape. Calscape.org, which I'll talk about later, is an amazing site. So his point as an entomologist is that insects and birds are picky, and they're going to eat the plants that they like to eat. And people find that odd. I mean, it's like, well, these plants look really similar to me. Why isn't this bug eating this other plant? But look at ourselves. I mean, our grocery list over the last year might have, I don't know, 20 species of vegetables max. We are creatures of habit as well. Excuse me. So insects co-evolved with the local plants for millions of years. It is thought that the the start of the evolution of California's plant and insect co-evolution started 3 to 5 million years ago. And they're not going to nibble on non-native imports. And the birds are, of course, going to eat the insects because it's high protein, high fat diet for their little offspring. So then that might be sort of off-putting. Do you really want insects eating your plants? Well, are you tired of pulling weeds? Weeds are basically non-native plants that have escaped cultivation and have escaped their enemies in their home continents and grow with abandon, and you're going to be pulling weeds with the second rain for 2 or 3 more months. So not every non-native plant escapes cultivation, but many do, and they can coat a hillside and actually cause extinction of local plants. An extinction of a plant can cause an avalanche, an increase of extinctions of animals. So it can actually build on itself. So here's a native flower, it's Phacelia. Phacelias are looking like a top of a violin or a scorpion tail. They've got this curlicue flower arrangement, which is really beautiful. And so there are perennial Phacelias and annual Phacelias, but it's going to be a native plant that is not going to be a weed in your garden. It's going to be gorgeous. So we want to flip things around in your decision making of what plant to plant in your garden. Instead of thinking, oh, I want a rose, actually there are native roses, but actually flip it and find out what plants are going to be happiest in your garden. So you want to take a back seat and learn what plants are going to be adapted to your site and which are going to support insects and birds. And you can throw in the plants that you find beautiful as well. So there is a campaign by CNPS, California Native Plant Society, called Bloom. And they actually have recipes, like a recipe from Bon Appetit, for garden styles and garden sizes, and list plants, number of plants, how to plant them, etc. So I think that is a great way to start. You can just search Bloom California Native Plant Society. This patch here illustrated is their sunny pollinator patch. So when you're flipping the decisions around, you look what corner of your garden you're going to be looking at and find the choices of plants that are going to be happy there. So there's basically a grid that's going to be plants that prefer sun, that's more than 6 hours of sun a day, or shade, apple shade, deep shade, etc. There are plants that prefer dry, which means intermittent watering, doesn't mean no water ever, and plants that prefer moisture, more continuous moisture, because California does have a few rivers. There are going to be riverside plants which are going to demand more moisture. So sun, shade, dry, moist. So you can have sun, dry, sun, moist, shade, dry, shade, moist. So you have 4 choices of plants in your grid. So you look at your garden and you say, well, I'm under an oak tree, so I'm definitely shade. I'm not watering the oak tree, so it's going to be dry. So that's dry shade. So you look at choices of plants that prefer dry shade. Obviously, size is an issue in a garden, and always take a look at the maximal size that the plant grows at and make sure that that site can accommodate it, because there's no sense pruning, and filling up your green can and making the plant not have its natural shape. Just make sure the plant has the size that works in that space of the garden. And then you can go from there in choosing leaf color, flower color, leaf size, et cetera, et cetera. So there can be a lot of inputs into the decision. So here's the hummingbird sage, Salvia spathacea, which is a sage that prefers shade, which is unusual, with these beautiful magenta flowers and smells unbelievably good. So if you're going to create a palette, if you're going to create a painting, you need a palette, and here's some paints. So here's some plants that are generally available at all of the slope garden centers, and there's many, many more, but this is basically your primary colors and your secondary colors for your garden. So Ceanothus is in bloom right now, generally blue to purple up to white, and they're evergreen shrubs. Ceanothus is a genus, and there's lots of species of Ceanothus, and they can be low ground covers to very large shrubs that can substitute for small trees in the garden. So I found this photo in a formerly vacant lot in San Francisco called gardenfortheenvironment.org. I don't know if it's still active, but it really had some lovely, lovely gems in there. So if you have a neighbor with a broken washing machine in their front porch, the Ceanothus will hide that. So a lot of plants I find may not be immediately attractive in the nursery, like a big petunia or something like that, which may be a little bit more flashy. But plants can have hidden charms. And the Ceanothus hidden charms are the flowers actually make soap. They have saponins. You can take the flower buds and with water and rub vigorously with your hand and lather up a soap after you're gardening. The seeds feed quail, and quail are just the cutest birds in the world. And as a shrub or a tree, small tree, it is actually nitrogen fixing. So people may be familiar with nitrogen fixation with their peas and their beans in their vegetable garden, and they can inoculate so that the root nodules have the bacteria in it that take atmospheric nitrogen, N3, very strong bond that plants cannot use, and break that bond to form it in molecules that plants can use, basically making fertilizer without you going to the store and buying fertilizer. So Ceanothus uses a bacteria called Frankia to live symbiotically in the root nodules, and is a nitrogen fixer. So it's going to help itself, and it's going to help its neighboring plants too. So many hidden charms for the Ceanothus above and beyond its obvious beauty. So your next paint in your collection as you're painting your garden is Pacific Wax Myrtle, Myrica californica. And these slides are available on the slow site as well. So if you misspell a word or miss a plant and think that something is going to be especially useful to you, feel free to scroll through the sites and find them again. So the Pacific wax myrtle is called Myrica californica, and it has a long distribution from Vancouver down to Los Angeles. So that's its natural range. When botanists and naturalists and ecologists look at plants and identify them in the field, they can point to their location, and this data is aggregated on calflora.org and other sites where they look at the natural range of the plant. Having it stretch all the way down to Los Angeles is a little comforting with the warming of the climate and the drying of the climate, that it'll still be happy up here. So it grows large, 15 to 30 feet. So it can screen out that broken washing machine in your neighbor's front yard. And it is a known host to 22 species of native moths and butterflies. So a host species, people think of the butterfly garden or the pollinator garden as having the open flowers and the beautiful butterfly land on the flower, unfurl its proboscis and sip the nectar and go to the next flower. Well, butterflies don't hatch out of eggs. Caterpillars hatch out of eggs. Caterpillars eat leaves, birds eat caterpillars or feed them to their young because they're soft-bodied and have high protein and fat for those little chicks to grow really, really fast. And they are the best converter of leaf energy, leaf food to animal food. They're basically a converter, like, feeding your chickens table scraps and getting an egg. So when I think of the pollinator garden, I think of the host plants where you're seeing caterpillars and also the pretty butterflies flying around. So why is it called the wax myrtle? So it has hidden charms as well. The fruit actually contains wax and can get melted down to make a candle. A cousin of this plant actually has more wax, and you can make candles more easily, but you can make candles out of this. The real hidden charm is its tolerance for wind. So if you live on a ridge that the wind whips over, or if you're planting a freeway and the 18-wheelers are going down at 70 miles an hour and making huge gusts of winds, this plant will tolerate it and not lose its leaves or bend over or die. So wind tolerance is its claim to fame. It does have wax, and it's another nitrogen fixer. So no fertilizer. It will actually have root nodules that convert atmospheric nitrogen to accessible nitrogen. And lots of birds are going to enjoy this fruit. The next group of plants, the next genus with lots of species, is the Arctostaphylos. Now, why name a genus with 5 syllables? I have no idea. I wasn't around when it was named, but the genus is Arctostaphylos, and most people are more familiar with the word Manzanita. But Manzanita is just one species of the Arctostaphylos. And again, just like the Ceanothus, there are species that are low growing and species that are large shrubs, or if you trim off the bottom branches, you can have a multi-stem tree and have a few uplights and be stunning. They're famous for being drought tolerant. Their flowers, they're in the same family as rhododendrons. Rhododendrons bloom later in the year when the rain has passed, so the flowers are open and upright, but these flowers are going to be in January and February, where it is hopefully going to rain, and the flowers all face down and are bell-shaped to protect the pollen so it doesn't get washed away. So that was really logical of the plant to create. So Arctostaphylos has hidden charms. Remember, there's a lot of species, and 3 of the species are circumpolar, meaning if you look at its range, where it's found in nature, you can find them in Alaska and Canada and Northern Europe and sadly Russia, all around the pole. So the Manzanitas way up there can bloom in winter. So you're going to see blooms with snow, which is kind of ironic. But that provides pollen and nectar to any insects or hummingbirds that are out and about that far north. Manzanitas can be pollinated by a butterfly because butterflies have that long curled proboscis and they can uncurl it and slip it down a flower and slurp the nectar. But they need buzz pollination, which is called sonication. European honeybees cannot do buzz pollination. So the bumblebee will be upside down and hold on to the flower. It'll keep its wings still, but instead vibrate its body, and the pollen will fall on its tummy, and it will comb the pollen to the pollen carrying appendages on the bumblebee to go back to the nest to create food for the eggs. So just like if you had a salt shaker and the holes of the salt shaker were just a little bit too small, you could actually hold that salt shaker upside down and no salt would fall out until you shake it vigorously, and then you can salt your French fries. So that's buzz pollination. Buzz pollination is required by all the plants in this family, which include blueberries and cranberries. So all your cranberries are going to be buzz pollinated. Also, Dan is going to talk about peppers. Those require buzz pollination. Chili peppers and tomatoes and eggplants. Some of those flowers can self-pollinate, but if you really want a better harvest, you need to buzz pollinate. And so commercial tomato farmers actually have spaces for bumblebee hives near their tomato plants. So any landscape architect will have a diversity of plants. Not all the leaves will be the same color, not all the leaves will be the same size, and certainly not all the plants will be the same size. And so a lot of artistic blends of drifts of plant include your spiky options. So those are generally grasses, sedges, and rushes. And there are a lot to learn about. There's 300 species of native bunchgrass in California. Their roots can grow down 20 feet down to the water table and not need irrigation. They can live 300 years. So you can put that as a legacy plant, just like a legacy oak tree, in your planning for your estate. When you pass it on to someone else, don't dig up that bunchgrass. It's a legacy plant. And they're like, what? And provides host for caterpillars too. So the Festuca californica is gorgeous. It's really adaptable for under oak trees. A lot of grasses preferred full sun, but this one actually can deal with shade and part shade. Juncus patens is a rush. It's dark green and very spiky, but not like poke holes in you spiky, not like a cactus, but has that spiky look for drama. There's a lot of lawn substitutes, including a lot of caryxes. So really important accent plants. And grasses have hidden charms. They are wind pollinated, so they don't bother with silly petals. They make a lot more pollen and just assume the pollen can get carried to the next plant by wind. And so this lovely poster from CNPS was drawn by the artist is Christine Jacob, who's a botanical artist, who's a wizard. And you can learn all these new words like lemma and gloom and blade and collar and ligule. You can act really, really smart with your friends when you pass by a native grass and be able to identify it with all these interesting characteristics. But besides showing off to your friends that you learned a little botany, grasses have real added benefit to your garden because you can walk on it like a lawn. It's a lawn substitute. Your dog can run on it. And our dog practices that every day. Grasses are really helpful in the corner. If you have a corner of a garden where people are cutting the corner to get to your front door for your deliveries, or yourself from your car to your front door, if you have a woody plant with a branch growing out, you're going to break that branch. But grasses are just going to bend and go, okay, fine, and then bend back. So they're really good for cutting corners. And they have deep, deep roots because they did evolve here before the invention of sprinklers. So they are drought tolerant. When John Muir finally came to California in August, everything was still green. Now things are brown or golden starting in April because they're non-native European annual winter grasses that have seeded and died and don't make it through the summer. So our native grasses make it through the summer, the perennial native grasses. So when I started tagging along hikes with CNPS in the 80s, I would smell a plant and go, oh, wow, sage. And then I would hear a whisper from someone else, sagebrush. And I'm like, what is the difference? So actually, there's a huge difference of sagebrush. Notice that's one word with no space, sagebrush versus sage. So plants that are very, very different evolutionarily can have the same smell or the same compounds of smell, like lemongrass, which is truly a grass, and a lemon. They can smell really, really similar, but they're not related to each other. So sagebrush is the common name for Artemisia californica, and it is in the sunflower family, a composite, Asteraceae, whereas sage is a mint. So this is the distribution of sagebrush in California, and it requires no summer irrigation. So those that are worried about parts of your garden that are not going to get irrigated because of restrictions and because of sharing water with the rest of the community, sagebrush is going to be a great addition. So there are hidden charms of sagebrush as well. It is so aromatic that one common name, one nickname is cowboy cologne, because cowboys would ride along and it would scrape along their chaps, and they would not smell like cowboys. In Southern California, it is considered essential as far as the critical habitat for a threatened California gnatcatcher, and is also enjoyed by a lot of other birds, including sparrows. So I didn't realize this, but I love tarragon, and tarragon is in the same genus. It's a different species, Artemisia dracunculus. I have no idea how to pronounce that. But so you can see that a genus can have lots of different species and be different. Sagebrush is so smelly to deer that this oak seedling has not been nibbled by deer. So it's a protector.
Joan, can I jump in with a question?
Yes.
You mentioned no summer water for the Artemisia, which is wonderful, but people get confused with the idea of drought tolerant plants and how you have to take care of them for the first couple of dry seasons. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So you kind of think like, well, how did any plant get established in California if it didn't get watered every 2 weeks the first season, maybe every month the second season, and then not any water after that? Well, there's two ways. One is in nature, there could be an especially rainy year where it rained through May and started early, and so the plant could get through that first summer without irrigation. The other is lateral irrigation. So if you have an oak tree with deep, deep roots, it's going to bring up water all summer and actually share it with its neighbors. So in a natural setting, there is actually a little irrigation. So in a garden setting, when you have a little 4-inch plant or a little 1-gallon plant that you're going to plant now or plant in October, you're going to watch it, and before it's stressed, give it some water, which may be every 2 weeks the first summer, and then every month. And then for some of these plants, like the Fremontia, the Fremontodendron, the flannel bush, wants no summer water. A lot of plants are very sensitive and will die with summer water. When it's warm, then it gets this fungal infection and doesn't survive. So it wants deep, deep roots and less summer water than a normal garden plant, and no summer water once established, once it's looking like it's growing and has a good roots. How's that, Dan?
Yeah, that's excellent. People come in and want drought tolerant plants and think that they can plant them sometimes without watering them. And that's of course not what drought tolerant means. And also many California natives start their life from a seed and they send down a deep taproot. And if you buy the similar plant that's been grown in a container, it doesn't have that taproot. And so you have to help the plant until its roots get down deeper.
Absolutely. Yeah. I always like growing oak trees from acorns directly in the ground for that reason, because you find a really pretty oak tree in your neighborhood. You wait for the first storm and all the wind brings the acorns to the ground, and you plant those in the ground and those roots are ginormous. Put it in a pot, you might have 3 leaves and the entire pot is filled with roots. It's infrastructure. So 2 good points. Thank you. Oh, so sage. So not sagebrush, but the real sage, which you can use in many cooking options, are great plants for the garden. And I'm really partial to this one called Salvia leucophylla, which is purple sage. This picture shows the foliage to be light green, but in a lot of gardens, it's nearly white. So a very good contrast plant, maybe with some Ceanothus behind it, because that has shiny dark green leaves. And quail love the seeds, and I love quail, so that's a good visitor to have. So this particular plant has not been watered for 30 years and looks pretty darn happy to me. And it grows gangly if it's watered, again, after the first summer and getting established and having roots. So there's a lot of sages, and most sages really love sun, but some accommodate to shade, and that would be the hummingbird sage, like on my first slide, and has very large leaves, magenta flowers, smells wonderful. And once established, it's going to grow happily under oaks and actually spread and be a good addition to your garden. So you can always identify a sage from a sagebrush, because sages are in the mint family. And if you look carefully at this stem, if you roll the stem in your finger or roll your finger around the stem, it will have 4 ridges. It's a square stem. The leaves are opposite rather than alternate. Opposite is less common, alternate is more common. And the flowers are tubular, they have tubes. So square stem, aromatic leaves, opposite leaves, tubular flowers, and you already know it's in the sage family. So you're already becoming a botanist. My current favorite sage is Lepichinia fragrans. So it's not a salvia, but it's a sage relative, and it smells divine. The leaves smell like minted grapefruit peel. And what's interesting is this plant has large leaves in the winter when there's less sun. It's like, where's the sun? Let me catch some. And smaller leaves in the summer to enhance its drought tolerance. Has really big flowers. A lot of sages, like Salvia clevelandii, have relatively small flowers. They're in a group, so they look more impactful, but they're individually kind of small. This one is large, and you see entire bumblebees crawl up there to pollinate. It's really cute. So this one's actually in my garden. It doesn't like a lot of wind. Where I planted it at first, some wind was kind of whipping through and it was looking a little stressed. So I'm thinking it needs a little bit of wind protection. If one part of your garden has a lot of wind, I would avoid that area. Next big shrub is the Calycanthus occidentalis, which is the western spice bush. And it actually is going to like more normal moisture, more garden moisture. In nature, it would be found in an area called a seep. So if you have a big hill and you're on the north side and it got rain, all that water is going to drift through the soil for months and months and months. And right at the base of that hill is actually going to be persistently wet, possibly all through summer. And that's going to be the natural habitat of the Calycanthus occidentalis. You can artificially have that habitat if you have a more watered part of your garden. And it has hidden charms because, again, the ugly broken washing machine, it's gone. It is deciduous, unlike the Ceanothus, which is evergreen. And so if you have a really shady, dreary winter environment, you actually want deciduous trees to let the light in. And there's something called tepals. So let's go back to the flower. If you look at a rose bud, it's green and it's surrounded by sepals. And when the bud opens up to a blossom, it's got those pretty petals around. And the sepals are green, the petals are pink or yellow or whatever color they are. Some plants actually don't bother differentiating the sepals from the petals, so they're called tepals, and they're alike in color and texture, just like every lily and every tulip. So when it's a bud, there's no color differentiation once it opens up between the petals and the sepals. So here's another plant which really will die if you irrigate in the summer. After the first year, water it once a month the first year, and then nothing after that, winter rains. So it's the Fermentodendron, it's the flannel bush, because the leaves are like your pajamas, they're flannel and they're fuzzy, and the flowers are giant, big yellow flowers, and many, many, many flowers. It's very florific. Butterflies like the flowers. It is in the Malvaceae family, like cotton and hibiscus. And there's one cultivar. What's a cultivar? Somebody found a particularly pretty plant and cut the stems and propagated it vegetatively rather than from seed, where you mix up the genes like your two parents, vegetatively, and gave it a name. And the name is California Glory, and it got first-class certificate from the Royal Horticultural Society. So if you're into awards, then you need to get this plant. So some plants, I mean, I try, remember that grid, sun, shade, dry, moist, and you figure out where your plant is going to be happiest. And I'll plant a plant doing my homework and try to figure out where it wants to be happy. So I planted some Epilobium canum, which the common name is California fuchsia. Of course, it's not related to fuchsia, but it has flowers that reminded someone of a fuchsia. The old name used to be Zauschneria. And this was a 4-inch pot with no irrigation. So the first summer I hand watered it, and since then I haven't watered it at all, and that's 4 years ago. But it has rhizomes, and it's shot these rhizomes 20 feet in every direction and started new plants where it prefers. So I figure I was wrong, and it wants to grow somewhere else in addition. And so just live and learn. So the Epilobium canum is generally propagates by runners, by rhizomes or stolons, rhizomes, and can propagate in the garden itself. It flowers, and when the flowers ripen, they become capsules filled with seeds. And these capsules, these seeds actually have the appendage, which allows them to float away like a dandelion. So I actually never pick flowers, because flowers are merely a stage in the vegetation. So first you have a bud, then you have the generation of the seed and what's going to protect it. If it's going to be fruit like an apple, or shell like a sunflower, or a capsule like these epilobiums. And then the seed. The seeds are super important to your garden, because although caterpillars eat leaves, birds eat seeds. And you know this by any time you tried to diet, because you can diet eating lettuce, and you cannot diet eating peanut butter, which is basically ground up seeds. A lot more calories, and birds are going to use a lot more calories because they're flying around. So my advice is leave the flowers in the garden and let the seeds develop, A, to propagate, and B, to provide food for your wildlife. So another big evergreen shrub is the Toyon. So some of you hopefully heard my talk earlier this year on native plants and what's so special about them. And there's a ridiculous Latin name or botanical name called Heteromeles arbustifolia. And hetero, other, meles, Latin for apple. And these do look like little apples. They even have little dimples on the bottom, just like a red delicious apple, but they're only 1/4 of an inch across. So it'd be a little apple. And arbustifolia would be foliage like an arbutus, which is even in the different plant family. But I guess that botanist decided that the leaves reminded him of the arbutus. So the Ceanothus, as you recall, had lots of species in one genus. This one only has one species in the genus. So Heteromeles arbustifolia is the only Heteromeles that we know about. It's an evergreen shrub. It's stellar for habitat. And what's amazing is range of plants. So some plants have a very tiny range, like Calochortus tiburonensis, which is only found in Ring Mountain in the back of the Tiburon Peninsula. It was discovered in 1972, I think. This beautiful lily. It only grows there. It doesn't grow anywhere else. Whereas the Toyon has a huge range and it can be found in beach sand. I mean, imagine planting a plant in beach sand, like good luck there, up to the Sierras. Such different habitats. So it's very adaptable. And people may be familiar with the poaching of beautiful small plants called dudleas and a new law that is prohibiting poaching of dudleas. And I thought that was sort of a new concept, but it's not a new concept. Back in the 1920s, there was so much collecting of Toyon branches for Christmas that they actually made a law prohibiting cutting those branches. So it's protected too. There is a landscape architect, Ralph Cornell from Southern California, from 100 years ago. And he is credited with creating the landscaping for Pomona College campus in a garden. And he talks about the Toyon. So, you know, any plant that encourages bird life, supplies the bees with unexcelled source of honey, I think he means nectar, gives food to man, furnishes tannin from its bark, protects arid slopes from erosion, paints the landscape with vivid colors, and carries joy into the home at Christmas when no other berries are available to most Californians, surely deserves the protection of man who it serves so well. So I think I should up my plant talks and start making descriptions like Ralph Cornell, but that's a Toyon, which would be great in your garden. I'm talking about large plants, but there's lots of plants that are really small and need to be able to integrate into your garden. And I'd like to make the introduction to Penstemons because they're so cute. The common name, or one common name, is beard tongue because there's some fuzziness there. And it is a genus, again, with tons of species. And Penstemons, the word comes from penta, 5, stamen, which is the plant part that makes the pollen, stamens, anther, and filament. And the pistil is stigma-style ovary that makes the eventual seed. So 5 stamens. So Linnaeus originally called it pentastamen, but then they shortened it to penstemon. So the penstemon that you might find at the Sloat Garden Center is Penstemon margarita BOP. So I looked that up and it turns out that BOP stands for bottom of the porch, where it was found in the garden center where they were propagating penstemons. So it was a natural hybrid that just was at the bottom of the porch, kicked around, no irrigation, and looks like this, like that is a winner. So it's sort of like a foxglove. Foxgloves generally like moisture. So this is going to be a drought tolerant foxglove. Big, beautiful, bright flowers. Not everyone. So for diversity in the garden, you probably want to add some ferns because they're just gorgeous. And you can get that Jurassic Park look without being on Kauai, Hawaii. So the largest fern in America is a California native called Woodwardia fimbriata, the California chain fern. It likes moisture, but you don't want to be constantly wet. You want to let the surface dry between watering. So maybe the north part of your house, if you have a little protected garden, might be really gorgeous addition. You do want to trim off the old fronds as the new fiddleheads are emerging. And if you look, ferns don't flower. They don't have flowers for propagation. They have spores. And if you lift up a frond, you'll see these sori, and they've got the spores that drop down to propagate the plant in nature. And these sories are oblong and they look like chain stitching. So that's why it's called the chain fern. The other fern, which is smaller, is the western sword fern, Polysticum unitum. And you can get that tropical look with only average water, which is really key. So this is backlit sword fern, which is gorgeous. And so these little leaflets or pinna actually get a little fatter at the bottom. So supposedly it looks like the hilt of a sword, like you may break, but whatever. That's what it's called. And we always think about, or I always think about plants from South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, coming into California and escaping, and being non-native invasive plants. But California plants that are taken to Europe for garden plants can escape also. So there's actually an article in a journal that was that a Western sword fern escaped to Belgium. Like that made the news in Belgium, which was amazing to me. So that's a basic paint plan. You can go on from there for the rest of your life. And you can start your collection at slope garden centers. You can start exploring options at a website called calscape.org. I would suggest going on hikes in your neighborhood to find out what plants really are happy in your neighborhood. You can use photographs with picture this, or calflora.org to find out what plant that you're looking at. And of course, cnps.org has the new campaign to introduce people to native plants if they're not familiar with them, and that's called Bloom. And this is a reminder that the Helianthus annuus was a California native plant brought into cultivation 5,000 years ago for food and oil, brought to Europe and cultivated to be big sunflowers that we think of today, and then brought back to California, actually from Russia, where it was developed as an oil plant. So open for questions. What do we got, Dan?
Well, I have a curious one here, which I'd like your thoughts on. Can ferns grow well besides succulents? Now, this would be a good question for which ferns can grow without a whole lot of water.
Well, the western sword fern, and obviously the bracken fern, really grows in dry habitats. I think it needs moisture to start, and certainly needs moisture in nature to propagate, because the spores actually swim to each other in a surface of water. They don't have seeds per se. But if you're buying a plant, then I would say the western sword fern or the bracken fern would be the most dry adaptable. But they can be separated by a couple feet and then be happy.
Right. Here's one that asks, are hollyleaf cherries a good tree choice if we don't want a tree as big as an oak tree?
Oh, wow. Those are gorgeous. So I think you're talking about the Prunus ilicifolia. So ilicifolia means holly-like, and Prunus is in the rose family, like a plum or something like that. And they're way nicer than hollies, because hollies, I mean, those leaves will pierce your finger. I mean, they are aggressive. And these are more like a cat's tongue. These are nice little pointy things, and beautiful small fruit that birds love. And it's a evergreen tree that has shiny, shiny, shiny leaves. It's really pretty and mid-sized. You're correct.
Yeah, and they grow very happily in the same kind of circumstances as the oak woodland. In my area in Fairfax, there are a number of them that seem to have naturalized. I think they were probably planted by people originally, but they've reproduced in the area and are doing really well.
That happened in Mill Valley as well. I had one Prunus ilicifolia, and then I noted seedlings growing happily.
I just want to remind everybody that that Joan's slides can be found either in a link that I believe Jen sent you all, or on the website in the webinar section under the Learn tab. You'll be able to find the slides there as well if you want to go back and go through them. And then, of course, the entire presentation is also will be available on Tuesday going forward. Let's see. You've mentioned 2 plants that you grow for oil. Can you share the process you use for extracting oil from sunflowers or olives? Oh my goodness, that's a big one.
So there are home olive presses available on the market, but they only accommodate like 15 pounds an hour, and we had a harvest of 700 pounds. So I do take my olives to an olive press. It's called the Olive Press in Sonoma, and if you have a lot of olive trees, you can have a custom press. This is $500,000 worth of Italian farm equipment, so something that was not in my budget. The Italians, they make Lamborghinis, but they also make the best farm equipment in the world. And a lot of the olive presses have what's called community press. You can bring in 1 bucket full and join the community and get the percentage. If you brought in 3% of the olives, you get 3% of the olive oil. The yield is 10% typically. So if you bring in 100 pounds of olives, you get 10 pounds of olive oil, which is actually more than a gallon. Sunflower seeds would also be a mill. So this is heavy duty equipment. I don't have a stone and a donkey walking around. So this is industrial equipment.
Right. Somebody has, it looks like, has planted some sapling trees, and they asked, should they plant full sun plants under the tree and then when it gets bigger replant, or could something like the hummingbird sage tolerate full sun until the tree gets bigger and shades it?
Probably depending on where you live. If you live, say in Mill Valley or something like that, you can plant it in full sun and it'll become accommodated to shade as the trees grow. If you're in a super hot summer area and you're south facing, I think the hummingbird sage would struggle. And so I would do 2 plantings, 1 for sun. And then as they migrate out, if they're happy in your yard and they could migrate either by seed or by root, they'll head out to the edge of the shade of the tree, and then you can replant closer in with things that accommodate to shade. Another plants under the trees, Douglas iris work great. I've got this patch of Douglas iris under my oak, which is blooming, and then Ribes viburnifolium, which is a native shiny-leaved evergreen gooseberry, which is low-growing, rambling, shade-loving plant. It's gorgeous, and I got it actually at the Slotin, Nevada. So sorry, they're all out because I took them all. No, they'll get more.
Yeah, those ribes really prefer shade, and we struggle. They live out in our sunny native plant area, and then as the summer goes on, we have to move them into the shade house with the rhododendrons in order to survive the summer.
But it might be interesting to see if the plants actually move out with the shade cover, and then you can replant. Oh, the other thing is the Festuca californica. That's a grass that likes shade, and that would be sort of more on the edge. That'd be pretty.
All righty. Well, I think we've pretty well covered it for today, and we want to encourage everybody, if you have more questions, ask them at your local garden center Your local garden center will know best your particular microclimates and be able to help you there. And all of the sloats have brought in some extra native plants for Native Plant Week. So we're hoping that you'll try them. Many are available in little 4-inch pots, so you're not making a huge investment. If you want to try some out, just remember that they have a smaller root ball and they're going to need a little more regular watering. And get them going, get them well established through that first summer, and then you won't have to worry about water so much next year. And we'll hope for more rain, obviously.
Yeah.
Well,
Oh, actually, Dan, do you know if you got many heuchera in? Because that's a really beautiful plant. Again, get them established with water, but they accommodate a drier environment and shade. They're coral bells, basically. They're beautiful. And snails don't eat the leaves. It's just remarkable.
right. Heuchera have a broad palette of leaf colors that are wonderful to use. They like dry shade, and the native that grows down in the Channel Islands is reasonably deer proof as well, but most of the hybrids that we have the exotic colors in, the deer will nibble on, so just keep that in mind as well. Yeah, well, gosh, thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Dan.
Wonderfully informative, and we'll hope to see you again soon. Have to find a little more some topics that make sense for us all, and go at it again. So everybody keep in mind, we've got peppers coming up, one of my favorite topics, and I hope you'll all, if you've been afraid of peppers, tune in, because I've got a pepper for each of you that you will like to grow, be successful growing, and love to eat. So
And peppers are from the Americas. They got introduced to Europe.
indeed they are, and they are one of our most wonderful, best looking and tasty fruits. So I'm all for them. All right, well, thanks so much, and we'll see you all next time.
Brian, thank you.
Bye-bye.